Well, given that the commandment, "you shall not steal," can be related to the product and the fruits of one's own labor, from the reaping of one's own harvest, living under one's own fig tree, how do we understand God's commands with regard to the poor, people who don't have their own fields, who don't have their own fig tree, or may have lost them because of debts and so on, people who don't have a means of sustenance? After all, these are our products, the fruits of our labor, and one is not to steal from them. Well, believe it or not, God actually works into his law that comes forth from the Ten Commandments provisions for the poor. In the law of Moses, he actually declares that as you are reaping your harvest, you are only to go over the field once. As you shake the olive tree to cause the olives to fall for the olive harvest, you are only to shake the olive tree once. Now, obviously, there will be the refuse that is left behind, and that is to be left for the poor. What olives on the tree, what wheat is left on the field after going over it once, is to be left for the poor. And we see examples of how the poor benefit from that, and examples of its violation in the Old Testament. For example, in the book of Ruth, Boaz, her future husband, observes Ruth and Naomi collecting the refuse of the wheat. It's a very famous and often illustrated image of Ruth and Naomi bending over and picking up the wheat from the ground. Well, these are two ladies who are poor, and they're collecting the refuse of the wheat. The owner of the field has already collected his harvest, and by law, he could not go over it again. The refuse must be left for the poor. If he were to go over the field again, he would be guilty of stealing from the poor. If the owner were to shake the olive tree and get all the olives, even the ones that didn't fall off the first time, he would be guilty of stealing from the poor, because God has commanded that the refuse of the wheat is to be left for the poor. The refuse of the harvest is to be left for the poor. And we see such prophets as Amos speaking of that practice in his prophecies regarding the unjust practices of the people of Israel. You steal the refuse of the wheat. That is what that is referring to. You went over your field once, and you went over it as many times as you needed to collect everything. But God has commanded that the refuse is left for the poor. And if the harvester collects even the refuse, then he is guilty of violating the commandment, "You shall not steal," because he is in fact stealing what God has designated for the poor. There is also in the law of God a sense of stealing from God himself with regard to what is ours and the fruits of our own labor. In addition to the laws which speak of leaving the refuse for the poor, God also commands that one must also make provisions for the Levite tribes in the nation of Israel in the Promised Land, because the Levites were a tribe that did not receive any land to till or to produce a living from. So they relied upon the contributions from the other tribes. And it is from that we get the tradition of tithing, that each of the tribes present and contribute the first 10% of their produce to the Levites. And then the Levites themselves, from that income, give 10% for the well-being of the work and ministry, and eventually the work of the temple in the kingdom of Israel. So there could even be a sense of depriving God of what is God's due from the labor of our own hands. We have our own physical property, but in recognition of God's great gift of giving this land, giving of our talents from which we produce a living, a certain amount is to be left for the poor, but also a certain amount is reserved for God and the work of the religious life of the people. And so, granted, we have the fruits of our labor, but one must also consider those in need and that from whom we have received these great gifts. And so in reducing what we contribute to, in the case of the scriptures, the Levite tribe, we could be seen as stealing from God, just as going over the harvest twice to collect the refuse, we are stealing from the poor. In the same way, we are called to have that consideration even today as followers of Christ, as Christian people, as Catholic people. We have the talents from which we are able to earn a living, to build up our families that contribute to our human dignity. We also must consider the well-being of the poor, as well as supporting the religious institutions which provide for our worship and our service to Almighty God. And so God doesn't promote a selfish hoarding of the work of our hands in giving us the command, "You shall not steal." While yes, things are ours and we must reflect a respect for other people's property and the fruits of their own labor, at the same time, we must exercise a charity that God works into his own law and is just as relevant and valid today as it was when he spoke to the people of Israel. That we are to take the fruits of our labor, to build up a living, to take care of our families, but also to build up the wider community, to share with the poor and those in need, and to contribute to the worship life as we give thanks to Almighty God who has given us the talents whereby we enjoy the fruits of our labor.